I don't think I can hear you. Can you guys hear me? Is it just me or?
No, it wasn't.
I can hear Mike, but not Laura.
Yep.
I can hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, we can hear you now.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes.
My headset was on mute, so yeah, was just saying, as you could probably guess, wait a few minutes for people to come, and then I even am forcing Jeremy to come to give me this that sweet screen sharing ability. So
Hello.
hello.
Okay, I cannot stay today, but I can enable screen sharing, hopefully.
Thank you.
Laura, you want to let me know if that's working?
It's working, and I'm going to prove it right now. Wow. Thank you.
Have a great discussion, everyone. I'll
Thanks.
see some or most of you soon.
I'm not FOMOing at all.
Yeah.
On where he is.
Yeah. Jeremy's in the pre-KubeCon excitement. Okay, cool. Thank you everybody for coming to this special bi-week meeting of SIG-MC. Yeah, I was honestly only expecting a couple people based on the doodle feedback, and a bunch of other people are totally coming, which I'm excited about, but I'm going to try and find a way to make sure everybody can get their input in either through this meeting or async. And I think the best way is I'm going to kind of start with like an overview and just like what we're even talking about and such. And then we can, I'm kind of trying to like guide the discussion to some open questions in particular, but I also kind of wanted to treat this a little bit more like working session so that I could get lots of people's ideas. And then also, I know I'll try and take some notes like here, there, and everywhere. But if you want to take some notes in the notes doc or anything, or combine later, let me know. And then also I see, Jack, that you have something that you want to bring up, which I think will also kind of interweave a little bit, I think probably with what I'm going to say too, so we can kind of just like combine wherever relevant. Cool. Okay, so I want to go back to this, which yep. Okay, great. Okay, so I had sort of half shown this last time at SIG-MC, but I updated a little bit and then want to use this as sort of the basis to talk about the agenda I want to go through today, which again, I mentioned, I think it's best if we kind of do a little bit of overview. And then what I think I really want to get out of this mind share, either here or like async, etc., is to both introduce, discuss, and collect some examples of this behavior that we're looking for, which again, I guess I'm going to overview in a second, and other documentation or products. I think that's kind of what Jack was also implying with the other agenda item. And then in this other doc that I sent out via email yesterday, there's kind of like my first draft of like what I think kind of the goals, non-goals, energy of this is, and some of the open questions that I have after talking to just a few people. So I would love to open the floor to that type of stuff and see if I can get some more insight. But yeah, so kind of to start off, and let me also get one other tab going, which is this one, just to totally start from this point. There is a proposal by some of the folks in SIG-MC about something called Inventory Cluster API, or sometimes called Cluster Inventory, or any other set of names, TBD. But the important thing is that this is trying to address the issue of a standardized, more central listing of clusters of interest for any multi-cluster tooling. So the registry of, like, if you were doing MCS or you were scheduling workloads to lots of clusters or whatever type of problem that needed to know that there were multiple clusters out there. There's lots of things that do that roll their own version of this, or vendors that obviously are, or providers that are capable of contacting all the clusters and their fleets and their deployments. But this would be about trying to kind of pull that together into something that is a standard type of tooling that some of the other projects of SIG-MC or that are adjacent to SIG-MC can also leverage. And I should also kind of mention, before my time in SIG-MC, cluster registry was a problem that SIG-MC wanted to work on, but at the time there wasn't like a lot of really strong use cases, or especially like use examples that were out there. So the scope kind of like around and it was kind of like tabled for a while, but this is a new world, and there's lots of great examples to pull together, and I think that's something that I really want to leverage this time around, or at least get the energy from this time around compared to last time. But yeah, so the first version of this CAP, which I recommend people to take a look at separately, but the important part that I want to highlight besides its overall motivation is that right now it is very narrow in scope to just being like list of clusters, and kind of that's it. Not a lot of other stuff about it, basically. There's some idea about being able to ascribe more metadata to those clusters, especially in terms of like being able to query them by some properties that they might have. But one of the things that came up in the early design conversations, but was tabled for now, was the topic of today, which is, should this thing be able to refer to, store, collect, or otherwise be a infrastructure to actually give the thing that has access to the cluster inventory API access to the actual cluster. So like, can we put like basically the endpoint for where those clusters are and some sort of way to obtain those credentials somewhere co-located with this stuff, so that this thing could also provide that as a service. And whether that is there's a lot of like specific implementations of how that could be, but I think even in the like top level there, in the conversation of this CAP in particular, there was is that even in scope? Is that something that should be included, et cetera? And I think that's still an open item of this group. I think that at least talking to some other folks who would like to use the cluster inventory API, it's something that would make it a lot more useful for them to adopt, because it's a functionality that they need. So that is one point of view on that. But I think, and that's why I kind of wanted to get a lot of brain power on it, especially ahead of KubeCon, while people might be thinking and talking about it. So that's why today is today. Okay, so that is the overview, and this screen grab is from that CAP, just to make concrete what the inventory cluster or cluster inventory API is talking about right now. And what it's talking about is about having some metadata about like what name something is, what's managing that cluster, and then having some reported properties, some like roll up properties that come back from either that cluster or from like its provider about what version that cluster might be on. There was lots of other conversation about other stuff that could be rolled up here. And also, this would be a nice place to put some conditions about some other types of status for each of those clusters, so that multi-cluster tooling could leverage that. So this is concretely what we're talking about when we're talking about today's cluster inventory API. Okay, so our question is in here, there's nothing directly about how do I contact this cluster or like where is it and stuff like that. And so those are the pieces that I want to discuss. So before this meeting, talking to some other people, I pulled 2 examples of things that do this. And so the original conversation I had, which was from somebody from Q, which is they're working on multi-Q, which is about deploying jobs, Kubernetes jobs for batch workloads to more than one cluster. And this is an example of how they are handling this problem, which is to have a CR for the multi-queue config that knows the name of the cluster and then a location of a secret that has the kube config in it. So the kube config itself is the important part for both the endpoint and the credentials. And this is just a reference to where that thing is from the perspective of where this controller is running, which is like on some central cluster that's actually deploying the work. Another example that was brought up to me, sorry, I can't handle that in the background. Also, I don't know how pretty this is for everybody, but I fear making it totally full screen because then I can't see your faces. Hopefully this helps a little bit. But this is a link. These links are also in the doc that I sent out, so you can click through to that too. But this is from Argo CD, which needs to know where its clusters are to deploy config and workloads to them. So this is also this is a secret that Kubernetes secret that has this JSON structure in it, basically. And so it has all sorts of other types of metadata in here that isn't necessarily captured by the multi-queue plugin right now, basically allowing for some other features. And yeah, I would love to let Jack sneak in here at this point to talk about how Cluster API does this, which is a good example as well while we're in the topic of examples.
Okay, cool. I'll just 10 seconds.
Yeah.
It's somewhat similar to the previous example, essentially a reference to a secret in cluster at a well-known location using a well-known data structure. So
okay,
it's actually a slight variation. So
sure,
it's nice that we have different variations in the wild.
Yeah, totally. Okay, cool. So so there's more than one, and probably there's lots more that I don't even know about. So I think the first just like throw out to everybody who's in here is if you know of more of these, I want to know them. So please tell me or all of us in Slack right now in the chat or in the notes for SIG Multicluster, because then that's something that we can build on top of and sort of combine all of the great brain space of everybody who has come before. That being said, I think what we can see from even just these 3 examples is that there's some commonalities here in terms of like we need an endpoint and we need like the thing that authenticates. I have a couple more specifics about that in my other doc, which I'll switch to, and some thoughts about like how we would want to do that is what I would like this group to work on. Okay, so I'm going to switch over to the doc that I linked in the email, and I'm also going to copy the link right now. Put it in here. Okay. That's fine for now. Okay. Let's do this, I think. Okay. So I basically want to start out by talking about kind of these like goals, non-goals that I've listed here and maybe edit them. And then down at the bottom, I have this whole section of open questions, which is kind of what's been top of my mind right now. And I've also pulled in some goals from the parent KEP because I felt like they were important to remind ourselves about what sort of cluster inventory overall is going for. So I have included that as well. Just want to catch up with the chat really quick. Cloud APIs typically return endpoint and CA cert, but not credentials. I can't remember the data structures offhand, but ACM, OCM stores credentials to access clusters. Okay, so these are some other good examples. And from my perspective, any data structure which can be later consumed by client Go controller runtime would do the trick. Okay, cool. So these are all some good examples / requirements. And in fact, I think that might be something I'll kind of think about putting in here if we want to at some point. Okay, I do want to go through the goals that I've written here for a second, but Justin, do you want to hop in first?
I wanted to ask a question about the
Yeah.
Argo thing. I'm not
Sure.
familiar with exactly how the exec bit works. Like, I think one of the topics that is coming up as a point of difference is whether the credentials are in there. The
Yep.
exec thing seems like a nice like way to punt it. But if it's exec, does that mean that we have to like bake in the binaries
Yes.
into Argo
Yes.
something?
Yeah. So I don't know everything about it, but I will say that basically local to wherever this will be run needs to have, like you say, access to those binaries. So this is like I have like even on your own like Kubernetes, if you have like I was just browsing my kube config recently, to like see what was up, and this type of thing is going on for my kube config for like my GKE control clusters, because actually it does like the gcloud auth plugin to actually like get the credentials as sort of like an intermediary. Go client supports a bunch of plugins that expect whatever the binary is to be present, and like the login to have already occurred on that workstation, basically, to be able to then make that authentication credential on the fly, or however that thing does it. So yeah, so this is something which in some prior conversations with some other folks too, if we go this route, which is a supported route by like client Go, so therefore by kubectl and etc. It's expecting that the place that command is actually executed is already set up for this. And that is something we could decide is like part of this, what this cap is saying, that we're saying we're aggregating, what those exec commands are, and you need to make sure like for whatever your plugin that you're like into or whatever, that you've got that pre-set up in places, and we can't promise that for you. So that's like a valid thing we could decide that we want to say, but that is how that ultimately works. Yeah. Cool. Okay. So just to briefly go over this goal section, honestly, just read this part in particular, because this is what I think we're doing, which is, again, establish a standard to refer to metadata needed for API access to clusters referenced in the cluster inventory API. So if you have clusters in your clusters inventory API and you wanted to ask the question, how do I get there and deploy something, you have the information. Now, I think there's some specifics we could say about who is you. Is you a controller on that local to that cluster? Is you like a person or something? Is that important because there's different clients that people could be interacting with? I don't know. Maybe we want to talk about who you is, but I want to throw out that that's a thought. And then ultimately, again, a lot of this is about accelerating those integration stories to make cluster inventory API easier to adopt, especially for some of these projects that we know do something similar or would be interested in something similar. Again, examples that I had been just talking about or talking to people are multi-queue, or like I know that Argo CD does something like this, but if there's other ones, I'm really dying to know. And if you are one of the other ones, I'm really dying to know. At this point, I would like to open the floor. If you can use the little hand react, I'll call on people since there's kind of a lot of people, so it doesn't get weird. But if you have some comments about this. And Stephen, what's up?
Yeah, so far from what we've been discussing, this looks like a push model only. And I think at least that should be optional. We should allow pool models as well. Although obviously pool models, well, we might not want to address that because it's a bit more difficult to specify where things go. I think.
And do you mind? So I know for pool model, are we saying, can you basically be more precise on what that means?
So the way I understand it so far, the idea is that there's a central cluster somewhere that knows how, well, or at least there's a data structure that tells whatever tools need to contact any of the clusters in the cluster set, how to contact them, and that's accessible centrally. So anything with access to that can access any cluster in the cluster set. The pool model is one where there's a central, well, usually there's still a central data store somewhere, but it doesn't necessarily hold credentials, and each client knows how to talk, each cluster in the cluster set knows how to talk to that.
Okay,
but
yeah.
Nothing tells them how to talk to any of the other clusters. And so part of the idea there is to limit splash damage. If you get access to the central data structure with all the credentials, then you can access everything everywhere. But I'm not sure that that's actually all that significant, because in all the pool models, as soon as you want to start doing any type of federation anyway, there's some mechanism for things to be automatically pooled and do things. So
okay,
I do still think it should be optional. This part.
All right. Okay, so I'm gonna put like a
if you want, I can expand on that in the doc.
Yeah. Push pull, help me, Stephen.
Yes.
I can't do it right now, but whoops. All right. You got it. Thank you. And cool. So great. Mike, what's up?
Yeah, I just want to talk about who's the expected. Is it the provider that is going to populate this field or data or whatever? So the cluster manager, or we're not expecting the consumers to come in and define this, right?
Yeah. So in my mind, it was provider, but I do think this is super worth talking about. If it's the consumer, that still feels really like it's still sort of helpful, but really annoying, I guess. Yeah, those are my first thoughts. But maybe Jack has a thought about this from Cluster API experience, or does anybody else feel something? Hey, Quarantine.
I'm not sure I fully understand the question, but I'm sorry, I didn't raise my hand.
No.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Jack. You go first, because I called you out.
Cool. I'm not entirely sure I understand the question, but if as Anonymous Mink is typing, I'm thinking that this is going to be provider specific plumbing that fulfills some kind of standard interface. So however we choose to define that data structure, which says this is where the API endpoint is, or this is how you reference the kubeconfig secret. That's going to be a common outcome, but each provider, each reference of cluster inventory would do that in its own way. If that's what is being talked about.
Yes, that is what's being talked about, and I feel the same. And yeah, I do think. Let me accept that. Thank you, Anonymous Mink.
Do you think that's possible to share the same data structure in both the push and pull model? I think that's, at least that was my interpretation of what Stephen was calling out. Like maybe the model itself is drastically different if it's a pull versus a push.
Could it be that in the pool you don't need credentials? At least wherever we store the cluster inventory, we don't need credentials because they're assumed to be on every single cluster trying to reach the central cluster.
Yeah, exactly. So my point was mostly that if we do have a data structure where we can embed everything that's required to contact all the clusters, we make that optional fields essentially.
The other thing I'd like to mention, I was thinking for the push model. So I guess we're only talking about the push model. Controllers that will use those credentials to talk to every single cluster, they may need each of them their own credentials, because otherwise we would not be able to differentiate permissions necessarily. So the resulting credentials that a controller would have to talk to cluster would have to be different. So maybe it's per controller or per client we need credentials. I don't know.
Jack, you're next.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, the push-pull is just an implementation detail. It's going to depend on the environment. I think that the data structure contract is more integral, and so you should be able to push it or pull it. It doesn't matter to me. I don't see why it would matter.
Okay, Buck.
Yes, so actually I think push and pull models are different, because in the pull model you normally do not need to have credentials stored. So that comes to my actual point that I wanted to make. We are now talking about an abstract API, and there is no recommended architecture or anything involved here. That makes the conversation a little bit more difficult, because right now, when we're talking about storing credentials, we're not talking about where we're storing credentials. Is it like a trusted cluster or set of clusters somewhere where this inventory is hosted, or is it scattered all over the place? These kind of choices, I think, will make our design different. So I think we need to think about those kind of architectures and then have a more concrete conversations about how to handle credentials and stuff like that. And I think assuming that there is a central place, which could be a set of trusted clusters where these credentials are stored, push and pull models, I think, will be different, because those set of clusters, let's call them, I don't know, admin clusters or whatever. So those admin clusters do not, in the pull model, do not need to access clusters or member clusters in a fleet. So in that case, you don't even need to store credentials.
All right, Grayzorgs.
Hi, wanted to say that from my point of view, regarding the problem which was mentioned to having a airbag per controller, I would say that it would be good enough to have just admin credentials delivered by cluster inventory, and based on that we can build a cross-cluster airbag propagator which can propagate and create more controller-specific service account and credentials per particular use case. But from my perspective, it's important to have at least the root cluster credentials somewhere that controllers can consume and build some tooling around that. Hope that it makes sense.
I think at least I do think a really important, and I'll probably put this explicitly in goals, that one of the, let's say, like audiences for like who would use these credentials is controllers specifically that need to then potentially do lots more stuff to set up whatever they're trying to do. I think that was like a lot the original use cases we're even looking at in the terms that like workload scheduler type things are kind of like high on the list, I guess, of just like things that came to mind when I was thinking about this. So I think I totally agree that that's a really important audience. Okay, so to kind of backtrack a little bit, just to connect the thread of a couple things that people were saying, I'm hearing some like mixed thoughts about, I hear some definitely interest in like push and pull both being supported. That pull may be mostly the same, but with some optional stuff being optional, or it could be radically different, hard to determine right now. But that it is important to support. So I think that's something that we can definitely put more of a focus on. That keeping it really abstract about the architectures is making some of the conversation difficult. I do think that is part of our inherited like requirements from both just SIG-MC generally and our parent KEP, that like having a specific reference implementation is at least that far of like the defined architecture is too far. But I do think that there's probably some more we could talk about what this would really look like. And again, I've thought mostly about the push case, so I am going to kind of leverage on that right now. But I think the idea of, is this like a reference to a secret somewhere else? Do we support external secrets? Is it that this is all in some cluster inventory that's on like some central, cluster that everything knows the access to? Some of this is like in the conversation, I feel, that are people's assumptions about how it may or may not be built, but isn't necessarily explicit. I think something that collectively, and myself in particular as a group, can kind of take to maybe make future conversations more concrete, especially for folks who are going to KubeCon, is to kind of enumerate some of those in this doc, at least, so that people know what is kind of in some people's minds. I think probably like the top thing that's in my mind is where there's some reference to some secret, and the secret is populated with like either that exec command stuff or like literally kubeconfig reference. And that secret could be stored using Kubernetes secrets or an external secret store. So that's like a specific case in my brain. But I think that there's some other ideas about that. And I think it is kind of important to us that we either leave room for other implementations, or at least think a lot about, have a lot of examples up front. Okay, and back to, all right, I think those were the topics discussed in this past round. I'm going to the chat just to see what's hip in there. And a plugin could read okay, so there's some topics about like service accounts and operator controller access, kind of ties in a little bit to what was talked about last. There's a scheduling question about the Kubernetes Contributor Summit. I'm not going, so I don't know, but I'm for it. So if anybody is going, you should totally talk about this. I'll actually recommend it to Jeremy, though I'm not sure he has time himself to lead it, but if somebody else is going who is planning to be there, I'll try and find somebody if somebody in this forum isn't going to be there or is interested. And then sorry, regarding the implementation of providing credentials, I would say defining common interface REST can be done similar to Link. Okay, so I will look at Link at some point here too. Okay, Quarantine, go ahead.
I had a question because there was a comment from Justin originally about the endpoint, the CA cert. And when we look at kubeconfig, there's always the cluster part and the credentials part. Is the endpoint and CA cert something that should be added to the cluster inventory? Is it reusable enough and enough in the definition and something we can attach to the cluster object that it would be worth it to try to centralize it instead of letting potentially every controller figure that on their own? And instead we could have them just focus on the credentials. I don't know what other people think about that.
Justin.
I mean, I like it, obviously. I think I liked actually what you said, Corentin, as well, about, there could be two different controllers or two different consumers that would have different credentials. And so we do want to avoid requiring that that one credential be in the cluster or in the cluster inventory, or if we do, that we are effectively saying that if there are two controllers, then we would have cluster inventory be per namespace, and we would have like different sets for each one. So I really like the idea of treating the endpoint and CA certificate separately from the per consumer thing. The one gotcha, I think, is it may be the case that there are internal and external endpoints in some, I don't know how common that is, but like, you know, for the global load balancer and the internal load balancer, maybe different IPs or names or whatever.
Gregors?
Yeah, so wanted to comment on this, that we actually have something similar with you, which uses cluster API root credentials to create per controller airbag in different clusters and propagate them to required clusters, because not always you want to put controller in the admin cluster, I would say. So therefore, for sure, there will be some need to create more specific airbag set for particular controller. So I would say that it doesn't necessarily need to be a part of this cluster inventory. So we don't need to move this per controller more scope credentials as a part of this as a scope for this API. Just having the admin credentials would be good enough to build some tooling which could solve the problem for more scoped airbag for controllers. And it can be even simpler to do this way.
Okay. Yeah. Nick?
Yeah, I'm really interested to understand the use case of running cluster inventory in a location that wouldn't need admin. And I trust that there's a good one. I don't have that use case in my head. Maybe this isn't the meeting to
Sure,
that.
yeah.
I'd like to at least understand that use case.
Yeah, I'm taking a note here. Putting cluster inventory somewhere. Like basically untrusted, or that.
Yeah. I've always
have admin.
Every use case I've thought of has always been around like a central, powerful spot. As opposed to like distributed to some. And there's again probably some really great use cases I was looking to learn.
Yep. Okay, cool. All right. I want to talk about a non-goal that came up in one of the comments, which I think is kind of like interesting. So part of this is about like providing a centralized place, especially for like these smaller integration stories potentially to like connect in. But then there was a concern about, well, if there's some other way for like credentials for like a vendor to like connect, like can they like prefer that instead, as if theirs is more up to date or something like that. And again, maybe this is like kind of abstract right now, so it's hard to specify, but is this something that people on the call feels resonate with them, I guess is my question. Jack, what's up?
The only thing I can imagine is it might encourage integrations to be more brittle, because an integration with cluster inventory might choose this path, which would then be specifically implemented for that particular like sort of provider that delivers its own credentials kind of out of band. And then when you would integrate cluster inventory in a different environment with a different reference provider, or however we're going to call it, reference implementation, that integration on the front end no longer works, because it's looking in a different place for the credentials. Does that make sense what I'm laying out?
Yeah, and it does make sense. I do agree it could potentially make it a lot more brittle. I think like if this was something that like in the spec we were like, and your credentials will come from like this something that follows this some function that follows this interface or whatever, like some service that responds in this format, but like where that is, or like how you contact that service or something, I guess, is allowed to be configurable. That seems like a way that like somebody else could interject if we felt that this was like important enough to specify. So that's like kind of how, when that came up, where someone was like, well, which I think is coming from the point of view of like, there are these like proprietary hyperscale whatever ways that like things can already contact their fleets of stuff if you're like in their world, and like where's the opening for that basically in this is, I think, like kind of the impetus behind that question. If we felt like that was really important to support, maybe we would be more like yeah, just like service defining driven about how this interchange happens, as opposed to like data structure driven. But yeah, I think that's what's kind of like open on the floor to me.
Cool. Is the material impact here that, let's say, these credential property definitions as we define them in the standard API would be optional? And so
maybe
to preclude them would mean to make them required,
yeah,
which would potentially not make sense for the types of integrations you're describing. We're like, no, we have a different way to do that. We don't need to populate this. That's harder for us.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, there's like a line here, you know, that we draw where it's like, can't work with everything. So like, I totally respect that. But while we're in the forming and storming stage here, you know, I know that that's like something on the mind of just like, there's sort of like the integrations I feel who are like, yeah, I totally you know, I need a kube config, send it to me, whatever, let's like do this. And then there's the like, well, I have like this really convoluted, you know, thing or whatever that does something else, but it like meets these criteria. And right now, some of those are just like big shadowy. I don't really know what they are, just that people think they exist. I would love some more concrete examples so I could feel more confident representing that point of view. So if you are one of them out there listening to me, then I want to hear from you. But yeah, that's what I wanted to like put in the brain space of everybody right now. Okay, catching up with chat really quick. And Stephen is now going to be the face of this at KubeCon EU. So if you're going to the Contributor Summit, you'll see him and talk about this more. Thank you, Stephen, aka Anonymous Mink. Okay, great. And then in our last kind of couple minutes here, I just want to roll on down to some open questions. I'm probably going to pull some over here from we talked about push versus pull. We talked about potential architectures and how that could impact our discussion. We talked about is it good enough to have admin credentials? Do we need to support more fine-grained credentials? E.g. per controller was discussed. And what is the use case for co-locating cluster inventory API in a cluster that isn't trusted enough, to get admin creds? Okay, so yeah, some other things that I had put in here, which I think are more like earworms right now because we only have 15 minutes, but we talked a little bit about optional, required, recommended. This is part of, I feel like, just this bigger question of like, are we allowing, like, do we want to support like other things to like intercept? Is it push and pull? If it's pull, is it the same data structure where some things are optional? Is everything optional because we let you do whatever you want type thing? So I think there's like 10,000 variations basically of this right now that we can't necessarily say concrete about, but I am getting at least a strong signal, I feel, on the push-pull question, that if we're definitely supporting both of them, that some things from push like just can't be there for pull. And so that definitely is going to be part of it. I wanted to kind of emphasize on the recommended, just because other things that we've worked on in SIG-MC, we have, especially on that point of like, well, what if somebody's already doing their hyperscale whatever thing? This came up a little bit for MCS, where like the original spec had like, your endpoint slices need to look like this, blah, 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 blah. And then there was a lot of cases where it was like, we don't need to make these endpoint slices. That's like a bunch of churn. We use this other thing, blah, blah, blah. And so we softened it to be like, if they exist, they need to look like this. And I mean, there's still time for that to surprise us all, I guess. But that is like a direction that SIG-MC has been willing to take to provide like some flexibility in that type of thing. So I just want to throw that out as a word that we have used in the past, and that if we think it's important to make room for that type of thing, that we can, you know, from the standards organization perspective of ourselves, think about that. There's kind of like a general concern out there about like credentials expire, people want to rotate them. Like if we, you know, put it in a CR and like it's your job to keep them, or the provider's job or whatever, like, is there enough infrastructure around that thing, secrets or CRD or whatever, that makes it easy for the parts of this that we're saying need to go in there that are secrets or that do need to be rotated to be rotated. So this is one of the things I think kind of like drives a lot of folks towards the secret side, and not towards like, you know, putting some things in like a CR specifically, besides just security implications, but also like the rotation question and like how fresh is this? So I'm kind of interested to know what people feel about this, what people have, you know, what kind of infrastructure people expect, basically. And in a general sense, I know that there was a comment, I guess, on that. I don't think I linked here, but and now I kind of forget where I read exactly, but where someone was talking about if these were stored in secrets that then referenced like object ref the CR instead, it's easier to like rotate the secrets than it is to rotate the CR to like change the object ref for a different secret or whatever, so that would be like a better linkage to say the secret knows what its cluster inventory object ref is. So like the people's rotation infrastructure that works on secrets like can do that efficiently as it does. So that's like something in the mind space right now that this is important to people. Maybe this is also something the auth people probably know a lot better than me about how often that rotation really is, or is to be expected, and how that would affect our how driven we are about being explicit about some specific data structure, especially if it's a question, but that actually has tooling around it, like secrets versus like a CRD. So yeah, that's on my mind if people have thoughts about that. And then this spec versus status is really more representing the earlier question that Mike brought up. This is just a way to ask effectively the same question of like, who's setting this? Provider, the consumer, like what both like who do we expect to set it, and like what nuance are we trying to get across by where it's stored, or like what part of the data structure it's actually in. This is kind of like an API like poetry question, I guess. But this came up in kind of the starting seed idea doc as well. Concretely, I'd like to mention that, for example, where multi-queue like has in spec, this is where the secret is, because that's something like the consumer is declaring, like this is where I put the secret. On the secret side, or you could imagine like if this was in a status somewhere, like the content or some of this content, like where the actual endpoint is, if that's coming from your provider, like you would expect that to be in status instead, because you're not declaring like where that endpoint is necessarily, you're getting it from somebody. So that type of question is coming up to, and it's just something that I want to make sure is in people's minds as we are thinking about what kind of data structure this might take. Okay, so that's what I wanted to A, get across, and B, get some deets on. There's even more chat, so I'm gonna like honestly download this chat right now and make sure that I have it to take some notes later. I want to leave the last 10 minutes if there's some parting thoughts that people have or something that they think is missing. It sounds like there's going to be a follow-up at the KubeCon EU Contributor Summit. So for people who are going there, keep an eye out for that. I know Stephen and Jeremy are both going, so if you don't see them at the Contributor Summit, if you run into them, otherwise, this is on the topic. I think some of the other folks from Cluster Inventory might be going too. So yeah, Nick, what's up?
Hey, is it abnormal to do these unconference things on a remote call? This is the first KubeCon I've missed in a long time, but I really wanted to be, if there is an unconference about this, I'd like to join it.
You know, I don't know.
Okay, I'll ask Jeremy then.
Yeah, I don't think there's any provision this year for remote attendance at the Contributor Summit. So.
All right, well, if I could, I'm sure you already have this on your radar, but Stephen, when the time comes, if somebody can be the epic note taker, then that would be metal. And then we can have another follow-up, like debrief kind of thing, I think, for people who missed it. And I think that
Laura has frozen, or she's just amazing.
Hello?
Your voice is heard. Your voice is heard.
Hello.
Oh, is she gone?
Hello?
Oh, you're back.
Hi. I don't know. I disappeared. Sorry about that. Yeah, I had said let's take some epic notes and also have a debrief after. I don't know if you heard all of that part, but I think that will get all the brain share spreaded. Mike, what's up?
So I think in the doc it mentions access / credentials, and we talk a lot about credentials, but I feel like even without credentials, having the API access URL or something, some detail, some configuration might be useful. So I just want to, I just want to have us keep that in mind.
Yeah, hot take. I like it.
Like, having the URL is might be useful, or multiple URLs. I don't know. It might be a list.
Yeah,
that's it.
It's not nothing. Yep. Cool. Anybody else parting thoughts? Jack.
Just speaking to my quick agenda item, I just wanted to do a preemptive ask for forgiveness. In Cluster API Azure Land, we're going to go. Thank you so much. We're going to go build a couple of these totally way too early reference implementations because I'd like to see how they feel in these different environments. So Cluster API and Fleet specifically. So I don't know if we'll be here in 2 weeks again because of KubeCon hangover, but we'll demo as soon as we have.
Awesome.
Some stuff to share.
I look forward to it. Justin.
I just wanted to mention an idea which I've been thinking about. I'm not sure that's a good idea or a bad idea, but I wanted to put it out there for others to throw tomatoes. Basically a proxy. So we can have an endpoint. It doesn't have to be the real endpoint. It could be the real endpoint. And we could then say, we will always take a Kubernetes service account token on this endpoint. If you need something else, put a proxy in the middle, translate that service account token however you want. The advantage would be you don't have to bake that into every controller. The disadvantage is as Quentin pointed out to me in chat, that we're now like doing auth or some variant of auth, but maybe if we can hand that off to someone else. Yeah, that works.
I agree with Justin. Actually, I'm a little worried about implementing like a full-fledged sort of authentication mechanism in this with TTL rotation per controller, credentials and everything. It's going to become like a major burden, I think, on us. So we should think about focusing on our main purpose, which is managing clusters and scheduling, and then think a little bit creative. I don't have a good solution, but think creatively about how to manage credentials.
I would say if we're going into offense there, kubeconfig should be the max we go towards. I mean, there's already an example of config for credentials, so
yeah, that's
should
a possibility. Yeah.
Totes. All right. Thank you everybody for coming. This was awesome. Lots of stuff to chew on. As mentioned, if you're going to KubeCon EU, there will be a hangout, and then either in the up next SIG MC or maybe another like off session if we think we need to do so. We will do a debrief about that and keep kicking it a little bit. I look forward to hearing what everybody talks about when they get a chance to be together. And Mike, you want to be last?
No, I want to go back to Jack's mention about the Within's implementation on the cluster inventory API. So Jack, you're talking about, are you talking about having the inventory cluster API defined in Golang, like with a kube builder set up, everything, so the consumers can, or the producer can, import that whatever Golang API is, and then start populating it? Is that what you're suggesting? Because when you mention providing a reference implementation, but then you said the cluster on cluster API and fleet, but how? Like, I just want to get the logistic. Like, are you gonna first contribute like a Golang into our project first with the type definition? Because we haven't set on the name yet, unfortunately. So that's why I'm bringing this up now.
Yes, this is why I'm asking for forgiveness, and I'm so delighted to have the preemptive forgiveness. I'm imagining. So I'm not going to build this myself, but I'm imagining we'll build something like 2 CRDs, a cluster inventory CRD, and a, say, CAPI cluster inventory CRD. The CAPI cluster inventory CRD in the cluster API environment would then implement cluster inventory. And so the set of cluster inventory resources in the cluster would be continually populated by this new CAPI cluster inventory CRD. Something like that is what I'm imagining.
Got it.
So just a sandbox repo, total skunk works. But I'm already super confident this is a great thing for CAPI integration for emerging multi-cluster workload ecosystem, because SIG cluster lifecycle doesn't really scope to what we're scoped to here in SIG multi-cluster. And so I want to tie those two things together, because there's basically cluster API is a multi-cluster native habitat. So it's kind of silly that there isn't a native multi-cluster workload scheduling story to put into that native habitat. So that's what I want to start testing out, that
sweet
intuition.
Thank you,
Cool. All right. Well, thanks again, everybody. You are now free, and I will see you on the internet.
Thanks a lot.
Bye. That.